Everybody, and welcome also to our online audience, which is out there in the cloud someplace paying attention. It's a pleasure to be able to do this. It's a great honor for me actually to introduce one of my oldest friends and colleagues, and sometimes adversary and sometimes colleague from both days on the Hill and days in the government and days when I was running a trade association and Alan was the chairman of my board. So it's nice to have him back with us, and it's, as I discovered talking to him, he hasn't been back for a while, and so it's we're glad to have you back, and glad to have him an opportunity to come and speak to us about a topic which is becoming much more in the news lately and is going to be even more in the news, at least between now and December 10th. Which is the date, barring other developments, that the appellate body is going to become non-functional. And so I think we're at a moment where the WTO has become much more present in people's consciousness, and it's become much more of an issue. I think the topic of the event, or the title of our event, is the trading system is not dying. And Alan's going to tell you about that, but I think you can probably say more accurately, it's certainly under stress. And one of the things we want to do this morning is explore a little bit about what that stress is, what the causes of the stress are, and what some possible avenues for solution might be. And of course, being in America and being Americans, the topic inevitably turns to us. And which means the question is the United States part of the problem, or is it part of the solution? And you can get different views on that too, and I think that's one of the things we'll be exploring within the limits of Alan's diplomatic limitations, because he always has to be, as an international civil servant, neutral and not finger-pointing about these things. But I can point a finger or two. So what we're going to do is have some remarks from Ambassador Wolff, and then he and I will have a conversation, and then we'll have time for questions from you all. So currently, Alan is the Deputy Director General. This is a 4-year term, which began in 2017, so he'll go through 2021. Immediately before that, was senior counsel at the global law firm Dentons, which is one of the world's largest international trade firms. At the same time, it was my great pleasure to have him as my chairman of the board of the National Foreign Trade Council, of which I was the president, and he did that for 6 years, which was probably a violation of the bylaws, but Vanessa, just don't tell anybody about that. And he, I think, did a lot to increase the organization's presence and stature in Washington, and I, for one, was very grateful to him for his willingness to do it and his willingness to get into the details of what the organization did so enthusiastically. Not every board chairman has done that. He also, as many of you know who've been in this town for a while, had a relatively long career in government service, culminating as the Deputy Special Representative for Trade Negotiations in the Carter administration. Previous to that, he was General Counsel of the same office in the Ford administration. He was the acting head of our delegation in the Tokyo round, and was the principal draftsman of the basic U.S. law that created a mandate for trade negotiations. He was a founder of the OECD Steel Committee, which lives on, perhaps in infamy, perhaps not. Maybe Alan's going to comment about that. And he was its first chairman. He was served as a senior trade negotiator in, or advisor to, both Republican and Democratic administrations. So he has a long history of service to his country, and a long history of actually service to our economy, and trying to improve the lot of his clients in the global trading system. Two of the most significant, in my judgment, have been the steel industry, which he represented for many years, and also the semiconductor industry, where I think Alan, in my judgment, was really the genius behind a whole of government strategy to try to save the industry from a lot of problems it was running into with Japan in the 1980s. And it ended up being a remarkably successful strategy, as you can see from the status of the industry today. But it was in no small part due to Alan's imagination and Alan's efforts. And I think he doesn't put it in his resume, but he should be remembered, I think, for approaching a problem creatively and figuring out a set of solutions, and then embarking on a very clever strategy to get those solutions actually implemented as policy. So with that, I will turn you over to Alan, and I'm looking forward to his remarks.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here at the CSIS, and particularly to be again affiliated with Bill Reinsch. We go back a long time when I was held hostage by his senator at one point for a crucial evening when we were trying to get a countervailing duty waiver through the Congress. And we didn't get it. I was trying to figure out what John Hines wanted, and what he wanted was to keep me in place for 6 hours so that I couldn't push the legislation through for the administration. What I want to emphasize this morning is the word strategic in Center for Strategic and International Studies. There was a vision in all of this where the WTO came from when Roosevelt and Churchill met at Argentia Bay on August 14, 1941, and one of their points for what would happen after the war was equal opportunity for trade and equal opportunity to access supplies. Equal treatment, an end to discrimination, was extraordinarily important, and GATT's been around, succeeded by the WTO, but the system's been around for 72 years. The question is it fatally wounded? Is there irreparable damage? Is it irretrievably harmed? I don't think so for a moment. I think that actually it'll persist. That's what my remarks are about today. What went wrong? What is right? What's the prognosis for the WTO? There's a banner headline in the top of the cover of the current Foreign Affairs magazine that says, "How a Global Trading System Dies." And there are certainly reasons for concern, but it's not near death. The level of activity has not been higher since perhaps 2008, maybe in the history of the WTO. Negotiations are proceeding very actively on electronic commerce, on domestic regulation of services, on facilitation of investment. The format is joint initiatives, plurilaterals, open to all, and not everyone wants them. Not all members want them, but members which account for 3/4 of world GDP certainly want them, and they're moving forward. There's also the work in the regular committees. The press, for good reason, concentrates on tariffs, but actually a standard halts trade entirely. You don't meet the standard, the goods don't move. You have a tariff, and unless it's at prohibitive levels, it will move. The work of the WTO to assist the poorest countries is proceeding. I chair the consultative forum on development for cotton. It is a mainstay for particularly 4 West African countries, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Benin. They have a per capita GDP of $2,000 a year. Cotton is essential to them, and the rest of the world is responsive. All are responsive. The EU, the US, Brazil, India, Pakistan. There's no dissent in working to help countries that are among the poorest to do a better job. There's similar outreach with respect to standards for phytosanitary and sanitary standards for agricultural products. There's a strong imperative now to make the world trading system provide greater benefits for women and for small businesses. And there's work going on with respect to fishery subsidies. Fishery subsidies are a South-South issue. The reason there's piracy off Somalia is that factory ships came along, heavily subsidized, scooped up the fish. The fishermen turned to fishing for tankers and freighters instead of fish because the fish were gone. So it matters. Strategically, it matters to the world. The G20, G7 in recent meetings called for reform of the WTO, and it's become a high priority for a number of countries. It's no longer a question of whether to have reform of the WTO. The question is how to make needed improvements. There's an emerging consensus with respect to dispute settlement, which we'll no doubt get into, and I will get into a little further in these remarks. The faith in the system is demonstrated by 22 countries seeking to enter the WTO, many of them conflict affected, fragile economies. They are a vote of confidence in integration into the world economy on the basis of the WTO. So despite all that intense activity, the narrative in the public is quite negative with respect to the WTO. Is it failing? It cannot stop trade wars. The dispute settlement system on December 10th loses the appellate body with respect to, unless a solution is reached before then, which does not seem to be in the offing. So no ability to appeal. No ability to reach major new agreements. Doha Development Agenda failed in 2008. There's nothing to replace it. There have been some agreements, but nothing broad and as substantial as the Uruguay round, certainly. Members disregard their obligations more casually, and even one major country questions whether it will stay in the WTO, that you're aware of. The article of faith that there was a strategic and global economic importance of having a multilateral trading system seemed to fade. It's now being rediscovered. So why did it seem so irrelevant? Part of it is unreasonable expectations. No treaty ever stopped two countries going to war. There were 3 treaties at least after World War I, and we had World War II. If countries want to go to war, they go to war. A piece of paper does not matter, and that's true of the WTO too. It doesn't stop wars. The business community became complacent. Could work around, the tariffs got lower, could work around various obstacles, didn't need to press to have something happen in Geneva. Business was dealing with the world as it found it. Governments found it easier to have bilateral and regional agreements. So the WTO was taken for granted. Well, the quieter times are over. The fact of the matter is that all bilateral and regional agreements rest on the WTO. It's the foundation for every bilateral agreement, every plurilateral, multilateral, not multilateral, but regional agreement. Most of world trade still moves actually under WTO rules. What will happen next? Some say, the world will move in the direction of 2 trading blocks. I don't see that as feasible. There are other economic power centers beside the 2 dominant trading entities, countries. There's the European Union. I don't see it joining a trading bloc. India, others. For developing countries, I don't think they're aspiring to a new form of colonialism. Actually, I don't see the world dividing into trading blocs. Why will the system endure, the multilateral trading system? The costs of being outside are too high. Even if you have a missile defense system, it won't be 100% a protection against trade measures, just as Saudi Arabia found that whatever defenses it had was insufficient to stop an attack on oil pipeline. No country can afford to be outside of the system, period. That includes the largest trading countries. The level of security would be far too low. Even if you could strike back, you can't strike back against everything that happens. Second, the economic harm to the country would be unsustainable, and to the world economy. If you look at Brexit, part of the argument is what happens to the British economy going forward. The UK Treasury said, estimated a loss of GDP by the year 2035 of 8%. There are other estimates, but it's quite a hit. If you extrapolate that to the world, not being in a single market, which no country seeks, a global single market, but not being in a single market is a $90 trillion hit. So there's a room for actually making improvements in the system between what the WTO provides now and what it could provide. That said, if there were no WTO, there'd be a much bigger hit than that. We'd be back in a depression. The chances are the members of the WTO are on the verge of improving the system. What the British would say is the chances are not negligible, which a phrase I enjoy. So what are the real problems? One problem is consensus. There are two forms of consensus. One is to make a rule, you need 100% of the countries agreeing, 164 countries. No one gets up and says, stop, don't adopt that agenda, don't move forward. So consensus is a constraint on rulemaking. On the other extreme, if there's a dispute settlement outcome that is considered to be erroneous by a number of members, there is a negative consensus, meaning 100% have to say, oh, we disagree with that outcome. That never happens. That's a null set, because the winner is going to say, oh, well, wait a minute, we want it to go forward. So you never get, ever, the members to say that dispute settlement outcome, the panel outcome, the appellate body outcome, is not to go forward. That is too rigid. So what's happened on the negotiating side is the plurilaterals came along, the committee work goes along, and all are welcome to join, but it's not a requirement of 100% consensus. Put in another way, there is no legislature. This was foreseeable. Someone dug up my testimony before the Senate Finance Committee in 1995 when I had forgotten this. I had to relearn it. I said, if there's no legislative function, then actually you have a real problem with binding dispute settlement. How do you change an outcome when there's a feeling that the outcome was incorrect? In the United States, we do have a Congress. We didn't always want it to be active, but it can correct judicial outcomes. In the WTO, that's not been the case. Second point, after the problem of consensus, is saving the WTO dispute settlement system. A distinguishing feature of the system compared with any other international agreement is that it's enforceable. And a functioning appellate system is needed, in my view, to correct egregious errors and to provide some level of consistency. And there is, I think, no disagreement in the WTO among the membership with respect to that. The U.S., as you know, has blocked appointments. There are 3 members left. You need 3 to make a decision in the appellate body. And as of December 10th, 2 fall away and become former members. They will continue to serve under their own rules if they're under rules which allow, in their own view, their ability to make decisions on cases that they were already sitting on. And they have about a year's worth of business to do. So there's no immediate effect if that system persists after December 10th with respect to existing cases. Now, new appeals can't be filed because there is no appellate body. There's no 3 members who are sitting. The U.S. feels that the appellate body has overreached. The EU, among others, feels that there's a court. It makes decisions, so one ought to live with them. And there's an impasse at present. But Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand, a very talented fellow who was their chief TPP negotiator, is building a consensus and gave a report last week that indicated a growing area of consensus about how to improve the system in ways that is gaining broad support. So what happens after December 10th? If you appeal and there is no appeal, the panel report, it might be said, is not final, so it can't be adopted. That's one interpretation. And a winning country says to the losing country, bring your measure into conformity now. And the losing country says, no, we're appealing. And the winning country says, well, we're going to retaliate. And the losing country says, we're going to counter-retaliate. And we've seen a little bit of that between the U.S. and China, more than a little bit, between the U.S. and China with respect to trade relations. So Armageddon, that's one possibility. The other possibility is pragmatism. Countries do tend to get pragmatic. One is India and Indonesia, not India, but Vietnam and Indonesia said, we agree if there's no appellate body, the panel report will be final. Others could do the same with respect to an ad hoc arrangement. If there's no possibility of appeal, then we'll pick three individuals, or name them in advance if you want. We'll have arbitration. That'll be the appeal. Or another option is the EU-Canada arrangement, where we'll try to replicate the existing system to the extent possible, using past appellate body members, using the appellate body secretariat. Life will be the same. It's just those who don't opt in won't be part of that. Can the impasse be solved? Of course it can. It requires a degree of understanding on a number of the parts of the major players. They have to understand really what the nature of their system is and how to repair it, and I believe they'll be able to do that. They're not there yet, but it can happen, and I think will happen. Members are still filing cases, including the United States still filing cases. So there is a belief that there's going to be dispute settlement that is binding, that continues. The U.S. position is we want to go back to what we negotiated in 1995. It is very much like in our Supreme Court philosophy. Those who want to look back at what was intended, the originalists, and those who say, well, wait a minute, life moves on, right of privacy means something different than it did to the founding fathers. So there's a clash. This clash existed in the French system and still does. For example, the French Revolution was fought largely over the power of judges because there was no offsetting power of the legislature. And that's sort of fascinating. It's the question of governance of judges or judges of government who are part of the government. And we're working our way through that, we being the member. The members are working their way through that. Is precedent binding? The emerging consensus is not entirely. So there are ways of dealing with this. Reviving the WTO negotiating function, I already really addressed that the ways are being found to move forward. Does the WTO have answers to current challenges? Can't prevent a trade war, but it can be part of the solution, either in bringing a consensus around certain subjects, which the US, Japan, and the EU have said that they were going to table a number of proposals. The first one out was on transparency, on meeting obligations to notify. Or it could be the US and China reach a solution, and that's embodied in the WTO rules as being generally applicable. After all, why should the two of them agree to, say, a rule on industrial subsidies, well, the four of them, US, Japan, China, and the EU, and that not have some broader applicability? So the WTO can be part of getting to the solution or can reflect the solution. There is general consensus that there's too much policy space. Policy space means absence of obligation. And the developing countries say, for example, the US and the EU have too much policy space to subsidize agriculture. So they should limit their policy space with respect to subsidies. They're not using, even the US at this point is not using fully its policy space. But do others have too much policy space? Is there a difference between bound tariffs and applied tariffs? There's lots of policy space out there to be subject to negotiation. Bottom line, in conclusion, I'm fundamentally optimistic about the future of the multilateral trading system. Part of this is because pessimism accomplishes nothing. So running around saying the sky is falling and not having some ideas as to shoring it up doesn't help much. It's also out of realism that the countries will, member countries will realize their interest. They all say they want the multilateral trading system. Now we need deeds to follow up on words. Also, my optimism comes from daily experience with the Secretariat, a group of very talented people, not a lot of them. There are some 700 in the Secretariat. They're very knowledgeable professionals. A question, if we ever got to reform in terms, which we're not doing now, of WTO 2.0, no one is talking about WTO 2.0 at this point within the organization, within the membership. But eventually, that will happen. There will be a focus on that. Adaptation is not avoidable due to rapid technological change. That's why we have e-commerce discussions that are turning into negotiations. Shifting in terms of the necessities of climate. Agriculture is going to have to move more freely across borders to meet with natural disasters, to meet with differences in climate from what we've experienced in the past. Fostering economic integration is imperative. Lastly, one of the responsibilities I have is to oversee the accessions division, and that's a reason for optimism. These countries are, in many cases, conflict affected. Timor-Leste, East Timor, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the countries in the queue and those who recently joined 2015, namely Liberia and Afghanistan, Sudan, South Sudan, they know about the same sort of experience that caused the system to be created in the first place. We went through, the world went through a world war, and it was decided we can do better. We can have a world trading system. We can integrate into that system. So the president of East Timor came, spoke to us this last year, and he spoke in halting English. He said, I'm sorry, I learned my English in 7 years in prison. He said, where there's trade, there's peace. And the ambassadors of Sudan and South Sudan, sitting next to each other on a panel, said the same thing, really. Where there's trade, there's peace. And there's a pretty tight correlation between the two. It doesn't guarantee peace, but it is a foundation for peace. What do you say to widespread populist pressures? The WTO is about fairness. It means your goods will not be discriminated against. You work in a factory, you make something that's very good, your company will be able to trade it across borders. You are a farmer and you are efficient and productive, you'll be able to trade across borders. You'll have an equal opportunity. You are son or daughter develops an app, they'll be able to sell that any place in the world. Are we about convergence in the WTO or coexistence? I don't believe coexistence is possible in the system. It is a matter of convergence. To get all members up to a high standard as envisaged by the founders. It'd be foolhardy to say that we've reached the low point in the multilateral trading system. It could get worse. That's not negligible possibility of it getting worse. There'll be maybe difficult times ahead, but I would say ultimately the WTO, the multilateral trading system, will survive and be improved. Thank you very much. Left.
Either one. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those remarks. You really gave a tour of the whole landscape, which is welcome. It preempts a lot of my questions, but there are a few left. And I wanted to get into some of the weeds. Some you mentioned and then some you didn't mention. But let me begin with sort of the bigger picture. And you mentioned the word populism. Can you say a few words about how did we end up where we are? Not in a micro sense of arguing about dispute settlement, but what's going on globally in trade that is causing countries to be more disputatious about this? I've written about this and suggested in the past that as far as the system, if you will, is concerned, that I think we see developed countries, the people that created the system at Bretton Woods, kind of running out of gas in their willingness or political will to defend it and, in their judgment, pay for it, and have growing frustration with emerging economies that who have not, in their judgment, stepped up to accept a greater share of responsibility. And I think you've got those emerging economies that haven't stepped up and haven't accepted a greater share of responsibility, suggesting that it's not really their role to do that. How did we get here?
First of all, I'd say that I'm a fan of Bill Reinsch's writings and often send him a note saying that was good, sometimes that was good, but what about this? So I urge you all to pay attention to that. Underinvestment in the system, as I said, taken for granted by business. Businesses, the U.S. negotiators were saddled in the Trade Act under which agreements have been entered into with, at the time, 45 advisory committees, which I thought would strangle a very small trade representative's office. And you don't know what to negotiate, actually, without the advice of those in the private sector, in agriculture and in in business and labor. So underinvestment by business, underinvestment by governments. It's easier, it was seen, to have bilateral agreements. The U.S. moved in that direction. The EU is a champion in terms of 96, there may be more now, negotiations that are either concluded, most of them concluded, or like TTIP, still a glimmer in the eyes of some. So move ahead bilaterally or regionally. A deficit in recent years of leadership. The U.S. has not stopped participating. One of the things that one should, I'm a U.S. watcher, having lived in this system for a long time. The U.S. is active across the board in the WTO, very active, as active or more so than any other member. And but it's in a different place. The Trump administration would be certainly the first to say it is in a different place, but it is not doing what it did before, saying, we're for multilateralism, we're the guarantor of the system, we're going to make it work. It's saying specific things. If you say that you will notify, then you should notify. If you say, and has been joined in that, as I said, but by a number of others, if you should not get through litigation, what you couldn't have gotten through negotiation, and that not all countries can say they're developing and get better treatment upfront, acknowledged before there's any negotiation on anything. And that's a major issue of contention, and there's some change taking place with respect to that. And there are proposals on the table with respect to that. The countries became, after the financial crisis, more sensitive, certainly with respect to liberalization. They became more sensitive with respect to liberalization because of a major emerging country, China. And China was rather sensitive about further liberalization. So liberalization, as such, slowed, but the need to make new rules has not disappeared. So certainly the rise in a feeling that trade caused problems. You can read Danny Roderick and others who say, protection can be good. I would say, generally speaking, no. His example was he grew up, his father was in the pen manufacturing business and ballpoint pens in Turkey, and he said protection was very good, infant industry protection. Alexander Hamilton liked it. It works. Well, at what cost? If you spend more on pens for your schools, do you spend less on teachers? Do you spend less on books, pencils, other things? And does the pen industry become internationally competitive? You take over the global pen market, or it was just a mistake? But the belief in liberalization for practical reasons and for emotional reasons, partially because technological change was far greater cause of disruption, but trade got the blame because no one's going to say, I'm giving up my smartphone. No one on the face of the planet is going to say the system would be well, there are a few, but the system would be better off with no technological change. Can't stop that, and that's a major cause of disruption. We got to learn to deal with it, and that comes through rules, which is what the e-commerce negotiations are about.
Luddites do live on, but let me pick up on that for a minute, because I want to get to the upcoming ministerial, which I think will be a significant one. But at the conclusion of the last one in Buenos Aires, Ambassador Lighthizer said, MC11, referring to that one, will be remembered as the moment when the impasse of the WTO was broken. Many members recognized that the WTO must pursue a fresh start in key areas so that like-minded WTO members and their constituents are not held back by the few members that are not ready to act. And I think he went on to talk about the e-commerce agreement, the negotiation that was launched at that time. Maybe you can comment on the concept there. We'll get to e-commerce in a minute, but comment on the concept. Are we really heading in the direction, I mean, people talk about plurilaterals. Are we really heading in the direction of essentially a two-track WTO where the countries that are willing to accept more obligations and more discipline are going to simply go ahead and do that at the exclusion of the others, and the others are going to be on the sidelines?
I think the system has always been multi-track in that developing countries, least developed certainly, we're not expected to have the same level of obligation as the most advanced. And the question is, what's the end game? Where are you headed? Are you headed towards convergence where everyone will trade at a very high level of obligation because they have a developed economy? In the year 2050, I had fun with this in Adelaide. The question was, what's the future hold for the WTO? And I chose 2050 because it's much better than talking about 2020. In 2050, Nigeria and India will be among the most populous countries in the world. With population growth, there are some who say demographics determines strength, self-confidence, ability to liberalize. I said that in the year 2020, actually countries that have grown a lot in population will be free traders. It's happened in the United States, it happened in the UK. It's sort of a trend that you end up, if you're competitive internationally, suddenly you discover the merits of open borders. And the world will change in that direction. But it's always been multi-speed. The Trade Facilitation Agreement is multi-speed. In other words, you accept a level of obligation that you can actually have the capability to discharge those obligations. The plurilaterals undoubtedly will take into account. There are some developing countries in Latin America, and Benin has joined, and Nigeria has joined the e-commerce talks, that they will have, no doubt, a different, perhaps a different level of obligation, taking into account their capabilities and their infrastructure. That's always been part of the system. Is it becoming more pronounced? It may well.
Well, the advantage of talking about 2050, I think, is in all probability you and I will both be dead at the time, and so
it helps.
We can't be held responsible for our predictions at that point, whereas 2020 we're likely to still be around.
I might say Bruce Stokes says that if you look at polling, the young are in favor of international trade and openness of markets and FTAs, free trade agreements, and the older people are, older white males, are against by majority. And he said the solution is the older white males die. And some response to that was, well, what happens if the young, as they grow older, sort of don't like open markets as much? And I said, well, we who have died will be very disappointed.
It sounds like, I think as long as it's a natural process, it's okay. At one point, my younger son came up to me and just said, when you die, can I have your house? And I said, well, you know, as long as you're not doing anything to accelerate the process, we can we can negotiate, and that's where it stands. It seems to me the United States is kind of pursuing, maybe pursuing two policies simultaneously, because on the one hand, they do seem to be arguing that the people that want to go farther should be able to go farther and do that via plurilaterals. At the same time, they're saying the countries that are lagging behind are lagging, and some of them, not all of them, are lagging behind deliberately, and they're hiding behind the facade of development in order to avoid taking on obligations that they ought to take on and they can easily meet. And part of our policy seems to be convergence. All those people should step up and should be made to step up by defining development more tightly. But on the other hand, they want to go ahead. The U.S. wants to go ahead, not on its own, but with other like-minded countries and leave these other people behind. Are we really inconsistent, or is there can you square that circle? I mean, you don't have to, but maybe you see it differently.
The accessions process is interesting. Of the 164, 36 came in during the WTO period, and as I said, 22 are at the door, maybe 23 or 4 by now, because a couple are going to announce. They take on a higher level of obligation than the original members, interestingly enough, by and large, on average. Why? Because it's a negotiation, and the needs of countries have changed because trade has changed. So there will be obligations that will be asked of, say, with respect to state-owned enterprises and other subjects of that kind. A greater level of obligation will be asked of those who are coming in, although undoubtedly there'll be some flexibility given with respect to how they meet those obligations and when in terms of time frame, but they accept a higher level obligation than the others. And they are very vocal about that, saying, well, wait a minute, us 36 who came in during the WTO period as opposed to the GATT period, we have more obligations than the rest of you. Why? Because it's a negotiation. Every member, it's consensus. Every member has to approve. So those who have an interest, usually the neighbors of that country, but always the EU and the US, say, well, we're very interested in your investment laws. We're very interested in state ownership. So the system is gradually reforming itself from within, and it's not, it's just no notices are taken of that. But inconsistencies in a country's position, that can occur from time to time.
Let's look at the upcoming ministerial, which is 6 months later than usual in June, which I understand because I've been to that part of Kazakhstan, and it has they proudly claim they're the second coldest capital in the world. So I think that December would probably not have been the best time. June is a beautiful time, but I want to ask you about a couple specific things that will be on the table at that point, although maybe one will be addressed sooner than that. But the first one is the moratorium on taxation of electronic transmission, the e-commerce moratorium, which I think technically expires well, maybe you can shed some light on this. Does it expire in December, which is 2 years after the last time it was extended, or does it expire at the next ministerial? And in either case, what's going to happen to it? Is there another extension in the offing?
That's subject to what any country wants to do with respect to it, because it can be blocked. It's a consensus approach. We don't know what will happen in December, which was the deadline for extension. It is a spur to the e-commerce negotiations to make sure that this is covered in the e-commerce negotiations as well. So don't know what will happen. The issue is a number of countries have said, a number of member countries have said, we're going to lose custom revenues. Well, you used to sell DVDs in our country from abroad, and we imported them, and we got 10% or whatever of the value of the DVD. Now it's streamed, and we lose $60 million of customs revenues a year, was one estimate.
Globally?
I think that's global.
That's not very much.
No, but it could be a lot to a very small country who cares about, there are countries who still, as we did originally, rely on customs revenues in this country for meeting their budget. So they say, well, we ought to be able to get those tariffs. It's a little bit more understandable in the case of DVDs in terms of conceptually. It's less understandable with respect to you're building a new port and you have a $3 million construction engineering contract from outside your country, and the government says, well, we ought to have 10% of that $3 million. That's a disaster. And it strangles development to have the idea that everything that goes through the ether would be dutiable. Is it impossible to gather those duties? No, you could have, for example, legitimately under the GATT, you could have a value-added tax, so you tax domestics and foreigners equally, or you have declarations like like we have in this country with internal revenue. Internal revenue is driven by declarations of income. Could you have a declaration of, to the Port Authority, did you have any foreign contracts? And what was the value? And if you try to tax that, development is in real trouble.
What about fish? Fisheries, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. This has been much in the news lately. I think the parties have given themselves a deadline of bringing something to the ministerial. Is that on track, behind, ahead?
There's very active work going on in a variety of working groups on the various issues. There's, I think, something like half a dozen working groups where there's rather intensive talks going on. It turns out to be complicated stuff. The fish don't tend to stay still. You could ask them to stay within territorial waters, but they move about. And there are also, although it's not going to be settled in the fisheries negotiations, but something has to be done where there's contested jurisdiction of whose water is it really. And then there's a question of capability of some countries license foreign fishing, but up to a certain amount, and they don't have the ability to police what is being caught. But there are new proposals on the table, including one from the U.S., I understand, that they're trying to come to a conclusion. The end is not yet determinable. So will we have something by the end of this year? Hard to do that. It's only 2 months away. By Nur Sultan, they're working for it, they're trying.
Well, ministerials tend to be action-forcing events, so I think we would look for something then. But those are two high-profile items. The e-commerce negotiation is another high-profile item that gets observers comment on regularly, and where there are active negotiations underway. What happens, say, about the WTO if none of those are resolved next June?
It's an open question what Nur Sultan delivers. There is ministerials are a mixed blessing in terms of, as you say, there's an action-forcing event. That's useful. There's also an artificial deadline when things are not ripe yet. Is e-commerce completely done, or is there more work to be done? That remains to be seen. But there's a lot of very good work going in, and under the leadership of Australia and Japan and Singapore, and the active participation of others. But there are still hard issues. Privacy is obviously a hard issue. Free flow of data is a hard issue. And the process is moving forward rapidly and in a very good spirit. Members, including developing country members, are saying, well, let's cover the following different sectors. I think the e-commerce negotiations are going to be successful. What's the exact date of that? We have to get closer to Nur Sultan to know that.
Even with the Chinese, you think they're going to be successful?
The only CEO at last year's public forum was Jack Ma. There's a strong interest on the part of China, declared interest in e-commerce, not congruence of any party with any member with another member's position. That doesn't exist yet, but there is a strong interest. The new head of the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, is a Chinese vice minister who is very intent on digitalization of agriculture. The dimensions of e-commerce are so phenomenal, the possibilities are so great. In Kenya, there is a crop insurance against drought, and nominal amount, nominal for us, not so nominal necessarily for all the farmers. There is, they apply for this insurance. They don't have to file a claim because satellite technology indicates where there's a drought, and there's a payout automatically. It's all e-commerce, and that's all domestic. Can that system be exported to other countries? Of course it can. There's similarly in agriculture. There's an NGO in London that tells the farmers in East Africa when to, through their cell phones, when to put lime on their crops. E-commerce is throughout, throughout our economy and the world economy. So will there be a successful outcome, and is China motivated to have a success? They're a major proponent of e-commerce negotiations. Will there be some tough issues? Absolutely.
On turning to dispute settlement, you went into that in some detail, so I don't want to go over that, but you said one thing that surprised me a little bit, if I heard correctly, and you said that you thought there was an emerging consensus on dispute settlement. I don't see that. Can you elaborate a little bit? A fair amount of the underbrush has been cleared away. Does 90 days to give a report, which is in the dispute settlement understanding. That's the limit for the appellate body to render a decision within 90 days. Does that 90 days actually mean 90 days? There is a consensus as reported by David Walker, who's the facilitator for this process. Yes, there is. Is there a consensus with respect to the binding nature of precedent? There's an emerging consensus on that, which is a big deal. Is there a consensus with respect to should members of the appellate body be able to serve after their term has expired on cases that they heard already, they sat on, and there's an emerging consensus on that subject. So the consensus keeps growing. Is it to the end of the process? No, it isn't. There is, as I guess Inside U.S. Trade reported, there are different philosophies as to what this is all about. The dispute settlement system, the appellate process, whether it's really a court or the U.S. view is this is a contract, you're interpreting a contract, you can't add or subtract to the rights and obligations. Is there a meeting of the minds that is possible? I think so, but we're not there yet. So, and that's a big issue. I want to get to the audience, but let me turn to what is always in the elephant in the room these days, including immediately upstairs where there's another meeting on the subject, which is China. And one of the comments that Ambassador Lighthizer has made in the past about China, and this doesn't really get into the nuances of what the U.S. is trying to do, but what he's basically argued is that China is, it doesn't fit the system. It's too big and too complicated. The rules, meaning the WTO rules and the institution, were not designed were not designed to deal with it and are not capable of dealing with it. The implication is that we need to think outside the box. In discussions with EU officials, they are clearly of a different mind, and they see the same problems but want to work within the box and within WTO the litigation structure to address the problems. Do you think the WTO is capable of addressing the problems that actually both those parties have diagnosed?
I think that there's a possibility of using the WTO to move the parties most interested towards a solution. If that doesn't happen, then they reach a solution outside of the WTO. As I indicated, I think it can be brought inside the WTO as a general rule if it has general applicability. There needs to be a solution that allows world trade to increase rather than decrease. Do I think there's a solution out there? I think it'll come in increments. That comes from my experience as you've had as well with Japan, that there was never a single solution. There was a solution over time. Ultimately, Japan did what it felt was in its interest. Ultimately, China will do what's in its interest. I think China has a fundamental interest, as do all members of the WTO, in having a working multilateral trading system. So the WTO ultimately, in one way or another, will play a role. Does it have the solutions in hand at present? I don't think so. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the tariffs across the Pacific that exist today.
Okay, good food for thought. Questions from the audience? Right here in the front row. Wait for the microphone, and there's two rules. Tell us who you are and ask a question.
Good morning, Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to press you a little bit on the fisheries issue, but I also wanted to ask you a question about the accession discussions. So on the fisheries issue, there was even not consensus on appointing a person to lead the committee that is supposed to be looking at this. Has that been resolved? And how do you envision that process sort of moving forward very specifically? Then on the question of the accession, you mentioned Somalia. There's a movement afoot to forgive Somalia's quite considerable debt to the international community. There's some movement to build ports and corridors to encourage trade. Do you see trade as being a kind of a positive factor for the Horn of Africa region? And then finally, just one quick question. You said it could get worse. What could possibly happen that could be worse?
In the fisheries negotiations, there's, to my knowledge, no consensus on who should chair, but that could come into place at any time, and it's not stopping the working groups from meeting, and there is an acting chair at this point, Deputy Director General Carl Browner. My hope is that the chair issue will be resolved before too long. It is the problem of consensus. The Continental Congress didn't want to pay for Washington soldiers, we're sort of, historically, there are analogies of trying to operate anything by consensus, and they didn't have one. With respect to Africa, yeah. That is, the intent actually was to finish by the end of the year. whether it moves, hard to have everything come together in 2 months, so I don't know how that works out. There'll certainly be a lot of work if it doesn't come together in December to have it come together by Nur-Sultan. There are a lot of complex issues involved. By the way, the U.S. is not a protagonist in all of this. It wants to have a solution to fish. It's all for it, but it doesn't have a huge economic stake in this one. It's a South-South issue. Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement holds some promise because intra-African trade, continental trade, is much lower than any other place in the world in terms of regional trade. And helping, to the extent it's welcome, that African Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement, to work should be a major objective of the WTO members. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of technical assistance, and there is already, because it's largely a framework agreement and has to be filled in. So bringing Africa along is absolutely essential, and I would hope that happens. And as most of the countries that are outside of the WTO, although the other place is Eurasia, Uzbekistan and a number of others in the region, Belarus, are not members, but the largest number of members that are not in are in Africa, but they're expressing a strong interest. So Somalia, they operate under difficult circumstances. One of their chief persons responsible in the government was killed in a bomb attack in the capital. Sudan, as I said, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. There's a lot of interest in the others who are not in coming in. It takes an average of 16 years to join the WTO. That is because regimes change, interest wanes. It's really because there are long pauses. So Algeria has been in the queue for 30 years. But there is strong renewed interest in not only in Africa but elsewhere. Iraq. These are countries not free from enormous difficulties, and they want to work on this. Bahamas is in the queue. Thought they could probably get in by Nur-Sultan, hit by a major storm, and I suspect that they may well be preoccupied with just rebuilding. So they may not come in immediately. But Africa has to be a priority.
Okay. Let's go third row back here. You, yes. Wait for.
Ed Bristwell from the American Chemistry Council. Great to see you as always. I want to go back to the elephant in the room. We talk a lot about China versus the United States, or the developed world. I think a more interesting question would be, I just want to hear your thoughts about China's relationship with the emerging markets, because you said very specifically some of the problems lie in the fact that many of these big emerging markets did not accede to the WTO. They were original GATT members, and they haven't opened up their markets. Is there still a fear of China amongst the big emerging markets like India and Brazil and Argentina? Is that one of the impediments to WTO reform?
I don't see the two as being related in terms of WTO reform. The willingness to move forward on rules is different than the willingness to have trade liberalization. An example is, for example, agriculture. The main issues are, of course, market access, which the Cairns Group and the U.S. want, and subsidies, level of subsidization. And what was true in the mid-1980s, which was the reference period for the Doha Development Agenda, is the subsidizers were the US and the EU. And the subsidizers put aside the current sort of emergency aid to farmers because of problems of access to China. The subject has moved on, the reality has changed. And the main subsidizers are not. They're emerging markets. They're not the major developed countries. And agriculture always gets tied up in also countries that are mainly importers and not exporters and want to have liberalization for things they have an interest in, which is non-agricultural goods, namely manufactured goods, and so it's difficult to move forward. But that is not, that's trade liberalization is difficult to achieve for those reasons. The rules are a different subject. Rules are a question of capability to some degree to implement rules. The opposition to greater transparency is stated as too much of a burden. Yes, there are obligations to notify, but that we don't want those expanded, some would say, because we can't do it. That's not true for the major emerging countries in terms of their capabilities. They're very good. But it's an issue that's a valid issue for the least developed, certainly, and some of the developing countries. So it's market access. There's no proposal on the table from, as far as I know, any member of the 164 that says, let's move forward on liberalization. There is a lot of interest in moving forward on rules.
Okay, Alan's got another engagement, so I don't have much time, but let's give him one more question here. You do have another engagement, don't you? Yeah, so this will be the last one, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Ernesto Fernandez from the Pew Charitable Trust in Washington. We are supporting the members and the WTO negotiations of fishery subsidies. You mentioned something in your intervention of the negative perception from the civil society that WTO is failing. And I think and we were trying to get involved, and we're trying to get others involved from the civil society or as NGOs, but when we mentioned that there is no chair and that this has been discussing for over 20 years, people get the reaction like, why we're going to get involved. But we still think that there is a value to continue pushing, and I think this works also for other areas, market access and services, how we get the civil society involved. I think that's important to put pressure on the members on different aspects.
Yeah, my thought is that we're a reflection of members' engagement, period. The WTO Secretariat doesn't put proposals on the table, members do. And members, in turn, are responsive to domestic interests. And if domestic interests are interested in something moving forward, then they try to get their member to be more energetic in moving things forward. Fishery subsidies, if that were an easy subject, it would have been solved 18 years or 20 years ago. It isn't easy, apparently. It's technical, it's complicated, and there are varied interests. Coming from the outside, an NGO can be affected by moving a government. I mean, the U.S. is interested, for example, in a conclusion and has put proposals on the table, as have others. There needs to be a domestic constituency in enough countries to make those countries active to say, let's get this done. Should illegal fishing be subsidized? No, there's some technical problems, but that sort of notion is a difficult one to swallow. You know, can there be technical assistance to help countries? You know, the smallest countries in the South Pacific, as I indicated, I didn't indicate who they were, but there are countries that give licenses that can't police whether the licenses are lived up to or exceeded. So there are some real issues in implementation in a number of these countries, but that is it is ultimately a solvable problem. It's a different kind of problem than the WTO has had in the past. And domestic subsidies are the most difficult issue. We don't have rules that are worth very much they're very limited. They're worth a lot, but they are limited in terms of domestic subsidies of agriculture or industry. And fish falls into that category. It's not export subsidies, it's domestic subsidies. And one is getting deeply into the political structure of countries and have to come to a solution. But that comes from really external pressure on governments to say, we've got to solve this one. And can it be solved? Of course it can. But it hasn't been easy, and it still isn't easy. Will there be a chair? I think there has to be some pressure to say, let's come to an agreement on who the chair should be. And other issues played into that other than it wasn't apparently motivated. The delays in appointing a chair were not, as far as I know, motivated by let's stop the fisheries talk.